Welcome to L&D Disrupt, the podcast dedicated to helping you overcome workplace challenges and prepare for the future of work today. I'm your host, Nelson Sivalingam, and I'll be speaking with the movers, shakers, and path breakers in L&D who are reshaping their organizations right now. Join us each week as we delve into the highs and lows of work in the industry to get to the real nitty-gritty stuff that you actually care about. Welcome to the sixth episode of L&D Disrupt Live. Great to see familiar faces and great to see new faces too. I mean, the reason we started L&D Disrupt was to build a community of disruptive L&D thinkers who believe L&D is a lot more than ticking boxes and believe they can drive business impact, improve performance, and build a progressive learning culture that actually adds value to the people we work with day to day. And we wanted to build a community where we could learn from and share best practices and knowledge, challenge each other for the better. And it's great to see that community growing week on week and to have you join that community. This week, we've got an L&D Disrupt Live first. So it's going to be a live workshop hosted by my amazing guest, Robleh Kirce from LifeLabs. If you haven't heard of LifeLabs do an incredible range of training courses across a range of different topics. They worked with companies like Slack, ClassPass, Venmo, and also How Now. We've used them a lot for our kind of new manager training and existing leadership training, and it's been really, really great to work with them as partners. Today, the workshop is around kind of building a learning and growth culture. Now, often when the word culture is thrown about in companies a lot, and there's some skeptics who think of warm and fluffy feelings when they hear the word culture and don't really associate it with business impact. And often they would be wrong about that, because culture is the kind of shared everyday behaviors we all do in the organization. It's the difference between someone feeling like they can make a mistake without being penalized for it. It's the difference between someone feeling safe enough to learn from the mistakes they've made. It's the difference between people feeling like they can contribute to changing in the direction of the company and the work they do has an impact. And all of those things I just mentioned obviously do translate into return on investment. So for anyone who thinks culture is just a warm and fluffy piece, they obviously don't realize the impact it has on the day-to-day and the results your organization drives. And so it's a very, very important topic and can determine the success of everyone who works in the organization and the overall business itself. And that's why we're super excited to have Robleh in the room with us to run this workshop. So you won't be hearing much from me for the rest of this workshop. I'm also going to join you to learn from the session. So over to Robleh.
All right. Thanks, Nelson. And happy to be here with you. Listening to your podcast prior to the session, just your voice makes everything sound exciting. So I'm hoping I can match the bar that you're setting just by setting me up today. Welcome, everyone. Again, my name is Robleh Kirce, and I started the San Francisco office for LifeLabs. Again, if you're not familiar with LifeLabs, we specialize in training primarily for high growth companies. And session today, just getting a chance to talk about learning culture. And I think Nelson set it up pretty well. Culture is those kind of like rules that we agree to on how we're going to interact and how we're going to get things done. And often the difference between success and failure in a really rapidly changing environment is how quickly the company and the employees can learn and adjust to make some adaptations. So we're going to talk about some really simple, practical tools that you can put in place that reinforce that. And that, again, is kind of what culture is all about, right? We have these artifacts inside of organizations that let people know we do care about these things, and here's how we do these things. Now, kind of setting us up for this session, again, if you haven't turned on cameras, do feel free to do that, in part because it's nice to get a chance to connect with people. Also, I just have a really fragile ego, and it's nice to be able to see people paying attention to me kind of helps me help you in that regard. So it's appreciated. Give you a little bit more background on myself and LifeLabs. So again, my name's Robleh. Started the San Francisco office for LifeLabs, which means I've been doing this for quite some time. I'm what they call at LifeLabs a dino, which I think is an affectionate term for someone that's been around for too long at life. I don't know if it's affectionate or not, but I like to imagine that it is. In addition to that, my background is in industrial organizational psychology. If you're not super familiar with that field, that's okay. Not many people are. Basically, just social psychology and statistics applied to the workplace. In particular, I study leadership development to help folks transition into management roles and senior level roles as well. And one of the great things about working at LifeLabs, I get a chance to work with literally hundreds of people every week at pretty great companies. So I get insight into how companies are practically doing these things day to day. So as we go through the session, I'll share with you some of the research that we've done on developing learning cultures. I'm also just going to share with you really simple best practices that we picked up from clients along the way. Now, putting this in context, this is a pretty critical topic. Again, we've got a pretty rapidly changing environment, I think, for almost every company that we're working with, which means there's more pressure on how quickly people can learn. And organizations are invested in trying to figure out ways to kind of drive that. Now, we'll start by just sharing some kind of simple, practical language around this. I think historically, folks have talked about a career ladder where you're kind of taking one step and then the next step until you arrive at maybe some peak of the ladder, and things are really clearly predefined. That's not true for most organizations, right? The organizations themselves have to change. The roles are changing. And so these clearly defined pathways rarely exist and they're rarely stable. So I try to change the metaphor for employees to not think about a career ladder, but instead think about kind of rock climbing, right? You've got multiple different summits. You get to choose your own pathway. Employees more now than ever really own their own career development. Right? We're here in support of that, and we want to demonstrate that through some artifacts and some tools and systems, but it's up to them, right? We're here in support of them. So we got three major conversations, kind of simple tools we'll share with you today. We'll talk about some learning plans, talk about feedback and how we can kind of encourage that exchange across the organization, and we'll talk about how we can pull from the learning that's already happening. Most of the time, we don't have to invent the learning. It's there for the taking. We just have to kind of capitalize on it. Sound like good topics for today? Seem like we're over the right target? Okay, nodding yes is good. It is built into the PowerPoint for today, so it gets awkward if you say no. I appreciate it. Start here with learning plans and put this in context. Now, we are talking about learning, but prior to learning, there are some things that are already happening. Now, our brains are constantly scanning the environment for a variety of different environmental conditions that tell us how we feel about that environment. And the workplace will show these 5 criteria, and they're really good predictors for engagement levels. And we're talking about learning, but I'm going to start by talking about engagement because if you aren't engaged, it's really hard to intentionally focus on learning. Okay? And this is something that I haven't seen in the literature yet. I assume that it'll come out in the next couple of years. But if employee engagement levels are low, how much energy and effort are they putting into learning and growing and developing? Probably pretty limited. The technical definition for engagement is that emotional attachment you feel to the work that taps into discretionary effort. So I'll walk you through these criteria really quickly, and then we're going to focus on progress since we're talking about learning. But certainty, this is our ability to predict the future. Like hint, hint, wink, wink, no one's certainty levels are particularly high since the pandemic era, right? Things are constantly changing. We don't feel that much control. Next one is autonomy. That's the amount of choice that we have in the matter. Meaning is how we see our work contributing into something that's bigger than ourselves. Right? Also something that's been critically important last decade or so. Progress has to do with both task-related progress, but also our career development, our learning, and our growth. And then social inclusion. Do we feel like we have an in-group? Right? Do we get to participate with people? Do we have authentic relationships? This is the CAMPS model. We share this with managers in a lot of our trainings because we want them paying attention to engagement. We also want some simple ways they can assess it and directly impact it. And this is not the natural temptation. Just to note this, when you're working with your managers, the natural temptation when you see someone being disengaged is to commit what's called the fundamental attribution error. What's wrong with you? This person's lazy, this person's stubborn, this person's argumentative. Maybe, but it's the environment that's driving those behaviors. And we can't force discretionary effort. You do want a quick demonstration? I can see in your faces. You're like, can we do a quick demonstration of this? So let's do a quick demonstration. And it's going to sound weird, but trust me on it. It's going to be worth it. From where you're seated, even if you're listening, from where you're seated, just raise your hand as high as you can. Okay. Now go a little higher. And that's discretionary effort. Right? Now, we've built up a little bit of rapport in the call. You'll begrudgingly raise your hand for me. Imagine if I followed you around and 5 more times during the day. It was like, you could put a little more effort into that email, right? Why don't you just put a little more effort? You could probably learn something from going through that experience, couldn't you? Why don't you just try to learn a little bit? That is going to get really frustrating really quickly. And so we're trying to craft this environment for people so they actually do want to learn. Now, we're going to focus on progress because that's the one that's most directly related to learning. Now, neurotransmitter that's associated with progress is dopamine. Everyone's heard the term. We get this released anytime we have a sense of progress. Right? So if you've ever written something down on a to-do list after you've done it just so you can cross it off, that demonstrates you're addicted to dopamine. Right? If you're not doing that, playing video games built on the same concept, almost every app you use on a regular basis also built on the same concept, that release of dopamine. And Teresa Amablique and a couple other researchers at Harvard looked at over 10,000 journal entries trying to figure out when are people happiest at work. Surprise, surprise, when they're feeling progress. And maybe not the type of progress you would suspect of like finishing a big project or landing a big deal. It's small amounts of meaningful progress, things that felt personally relevant. Now, what we're trying to focus on here is getting folks to take this seriously, put some intentional effort into their development. Learning plans, kind of the simple way to do that. Now, putting this in context, though, everyone's busy, right? And these are pretty easy to delay. I think most companies, a large percentage of people suffer from some version of procrastination for their task-related work, let alone development-related work. Right? Very easy to put these things off. So I'm going to share with you a really, really simple tool that we use to kind of just set these things up. And feel free to take from it what you want. Anything that you don't love, skip it. What you're looking at here is a table. So I'm going to walk you through it. Also for folks that are listening in, timeframes. Let's start there. If you're in people ops and HR, our job is honestly to kind of create the minimum viable expectation for people across the organization here. Right? And we're like, hey, can you at least twice a year have a conversation about development? Right? That'd be great. Thanks. In reality, these should probably be monthly, quarterly conversations. And the way I convince managers of this is like, hey, look, the needs of your team are going to change over the course of 6 months or a year. Right? So we need development goals that are in line with what's actually happening on your team. Usually these are monthly goals, sometimes quarterly goals. Specific areas you want to improve, nobody is specific. 9 times out of 9, people write down development goals that are so we call blurry, meaning open to interpretation. They're practically useless. Now, they are useful in the sense that now we know what to dig in on, but managers have to help them get specific. It can't just be, I'm working to improve my verbal communication. We want something like, I want to get better at holding people to agendas in meetings, right? We can narrow the scope a little bit. Impact statement, that's designed to make sure folks are working on something that's relevant to the team and to your business. Right? If we leave it open, folks can, hey, I want to get better at, I don't know, doing meditation retreats in Hawaii. I'd love to do that too, but it's not super relevant to what's going on in the team. Current levels. So we ask people on a scale of 1 to 10, where are they right now? Right? Scaling questions are designed to highlight the discrepancy between current state and implied ideal state of 9 or 10. That boosts motivation when people have that discrepancy highlighted. Now, here's my favorite tool in this, and if you take nothing else out of this, this is probably worth our time together. These 3 E's. All development anybody is ever going to do is going to fit in one of these 3 categories: education, experience, or exposure. Now, it's really nice from a management perspective here, and what makes this a simple tool to use is they know where the conversation is going to end before they start it. And then action plans. Now, here we're trying to craft what I call a Kaizen next step. A Kaizen next step is so granular, you can make significant progress in 1 minute. And every development goal will eventually come down to that level of granularity. Now, if we don't get them to identify what the Kaizen goal is, people procrastinate. Right? So imagine I tell you what my development goal, I'm going to go get thoughts from Sue and Carol and Joe. And once I've got their thoughts, I'll put together a proposal on how I can get better at this thing. it'll be 2 months. You won't hear from me. I won't have done anything. Right? Now, the Kaizen version of that, and the question I would probably ask is, when do you have time to send the calendar invites to Sue, Carol, and Joe? Right? Significant progress in 1 minute, and people take action on those things. And so for avoiding procrastination, that's one of those quick, simple tools to get past it. Now, I do want to pause here, open up the floor, and just create space for questions and tips that you've picked up in your careers on learning plans, because I think most organizations have some version of this. So thoughts or advice? And I'll give you maybe 20 seconds to collect your thoughts here, and just hop off mute or type into chat questions and or tips. Maybe we should have warned you. It's an interactive session here today. All right. So the question is, how can you use this in manufacturing where individuals have specific SOPs, training to learn? Okay, great question. Thanks for adding it there. Now, there are almost always going to be some technical aspects of roles where people are required to do certain things. And there are almost also, we call it kind of these universal skills that are going to be relevant. And the way I'm going to answer the question, it's going to be useful here for manufacturing where there's SOPs. It's also useful when employees are like, I'm not sure exactly what I want to do next or what my next step is. Right? There are things that are almost like influence, for example, almost always going to be relevant. Right? Meeting skills, almost always going to be relevant. Even some version of analysis or strategic thinking, almost always going to be relevant. And so trying to find these universal skills. And if you send us an email after the session, I can send you a list that we have of these types of skills that are almost always going to be relevant for folks' next steps. All right, we're not seeing any other questions here yet, so I'm going to roll it forward, but fair warning, at the end of the next section, I'll do the same thing. I'll create space for questions and or tips. And we can see another thing in chat here. I always try to have one quick win result. Yeah, it helps with buy-in. Absolutely. There's something called the Berg effect. Anyone heard of this? BIRG. It stands for basking in reflected glory. Researchers looked at this as they would go to local sporting events, and after people were leaving, they'd ask the fans, how did the local team do? And people would say, oh, they lost, or oh, we won. They lost, we won, right? We like to be associated with success. So those quick wins get additional buy-in and support from folks. Tip, make learning plans visible for all, if consensual. Yep. That way people can use synergies, self-organize around learning groups. Great. Thanks for sharing these. That's one of the, I think, value adds of having sessions like this. There's a lot of experience here on the call. So please keep sharing. Don't be selfish with your tips. Don't keep them secret. Let them free. All right, let's roll it into our second one here on feedback norms. Now, here we're working a little bit uphill in a variety of forms. Start here with this pink dot that we've got represented on the image in a brain. So if you're listening in, anyone have a guess at what this pink dot represents? It starts with an A, ends with an A. Yeah, I can see it. Penny's mouthing it. Yeah, amygdala. Yeah, she got it. Yeah, amygdala is one of those things that triggers whether or not the information we're taking in gets processed in the neocortex, where we do our rational, logical thinking, or if it gets processed in the limbic system. Right? Now, this is relevant in a variety of factors, but if the amygdala is triggered by a threat in the environment, we process the information almost exclusively in the limbic system, and that triggers an emotional reaction. Now, so we're trying to give somebody feedback. We want to keep them in the neocortex where they're logically listening to it and processing that information. They can logically choose to do something about it. Amygdala is great if you're being chased by a sort of apex predator. You don't want to think about what's the coolest way to get away. You just want to get away. Not so useful. People are reacting emotionally to the feedback. So our goal here, making sure that we are exchanging feedback that is brain friendly, or in other words, staying in the neocortex because it's receivable and actionable by the recipient. In order to do that, it's a little trickier than it sounds. We're going to make sure that we're giving specific feedback. And the easiest way to do that, make sure you can give feedback you could literally see or hear on camera. Working with managers, we try to provide them, we call it cognitive scaffolding. Cognitive scaffolding, kind of a fancy word for like tools that allow people to think differently, maybe reach new access points. And terminology, just labels for things, go a long way. So what you're seeing here is a feedback method. We call it the playing card method, where people can quickly label whether feedback is useful or not, and then adjust the conversation as necessary. So club is blurry feedback, not very specific, and it's also a critique. It's like a club to the back of the head. It's not very useful in a feedback conversation. A heart, it's blurry, it's not specific, but it's praise. It's kind of like heart candy. There's no real nutritional value, but it's sort of sweet. And what we're actually looking for here are spades and diamonds. Spade, specific critique, and a diamond, specific praise. Once people have this terminology, and you make up your own, ours is, I think, actually trademarked, so don't try to like sell this to somebody else, right? You pivot your business and start teaching this. But once folks have this terminology, they can quickly identify like, oh, is this feedback useful or not? So if someone says, I don't think you handled that situation with the client very well, hey, can we turn the club into a spade? What specifically were you looking at? What specifically are you paying attention to? Much more common in the workplace is hearts, right? Someone, hey, great job on the presentation yesterday. You crushed it. Like, oh, thanks for the heart. What did you notice? Right? What's repeatable for me in the future? Right? And we get down to those specifics, makes it a lot easier to manage. Now, we'll note that this is just one of the challenges that you're dealing with in exchanging feedback. Our brains are significantly over-designed to identify threats in the environment in comparison to rewards. And brain architecture for picking out threats in comparison to rewards maybe as high as 7-1. It's really significant. I can demonstrate this for you all really quickly. Anyone when you were in the office, some of you working remotely, ever have access to like free drinks and snacks in the office? Is that a thing? Yeah. Okay. Maybe you remember the first time your place of employment offered you free drinks and snacks. You're like, wait, what? You're going to pay me and you're going to give me lunch too? Oh my goodness. Wow. That's amazing. And then a couple of weeks went by, they ran out of your favorite snack and you just lost your mind, right? No peanut crunchy, blah, blah, blah. No nitro caffeine. No ripe avocados. How are we supposed to run a business? Can't even keep profit. Right? That process of something being amazing fades to neutral, and now neutral is absent. That's negative. That process takes about 2 to 3 weeks. Right? So what really impressed us when someone walked in the door fades to neutral after a few weeks, and then they made a mistake, and what did they get feedback on? The mistake. Right? So most folks getting overemphasis on negative feedback. And this also manifests in our internal monologue. We're going to go very deep here today. We're going to take a moment. Right? In our internal monologue, we go like, oh, can't believe so-and-so missed the deadline again. Their manager never does anything about it. We should fire both of them. Right? I've got stuff to do today. I don't have time for this meeting. We run out of external stuff and it goes internal. And we're like, I'm not that good either. I should read more. I should go to the gym more. I should go spend more time with my family. Right? So this internal monologue generating thoughts, often at a ratio of 7-1 negative, is it any surprise that our early career folks are looking for some positive feedback? They want to quiet down that internal monologue for just a moment. Right? So often we want to train managers not just to give this critical feedback in the development process, but also make sure they're highlighting what people are doing particularly well. We have to go out of our way to build habits there. Now, the good news, again, coming back to some of the brain science here, you have a reticular activation center portion of the brain, which is a pattern note-making portion of the brain. You can train that portion of the brain to notice positive patterns. Now, hopefully my girlfriend doesn't listen to this podcast, but here's a nice trick. At the end of the night, I tell her at least 1 or 2 things that I appreciate about her and our relationship. And this does two things. One, she feels appreciated, which is nice because I'd like to stay in the relationship. But then two, it trains my brain to stay focused on what's going well, right? Same thing from an org perspective, right? Once a day, send out one positive piece of feedback. Someone did something well. Retrain our our employees' brains to focus on things that are going well. And not rose-colored glasses, just a more accurate perception of what's really going on. So you've got a couple different takeaways here. You've got the tool is some vocabulary so we can quickly identify, is this feedback useful, right? Critically important, but also maybe establish some habits where folks are encouraged to give positive feedback. More accurate perception of reality. Pause here, and you know it's coming. Right? I'm going to ask you for questions and or tips that you have when it comes to feedback. I think this can be a challenging thing in orgs. So open up the floor. Maybe give it, again, 20 seconds to collect your thoughts here. Tips and questions. All right. I do like that nice heart in chat. We got a chat saying, love this. Makes me, my fragile ego does appreciate hearts, by the way. So it's great. All right. No one's going to go to bed tonight and be like, I can't believe I didn't share my wisdom. Now I can't sleep. All right, forward we go. We're going to jump into our third and final conversation here around learning extractions. Now, here, the goal is to transition from kind of just like, yeah, I'm aware of something exists into active working memory. And then if everything goes well, this becomes part of our daily routines. We're trying to build some neural pathways so folks actually develop habits with the tools and learnings that we're talking about. And kind of transitioning from generally being informed, right? Like it's one thing to know what swimming is or be able to recognize that somebody is swimming versus be able to, I actually can do this myself. I do this on a regular basis. I know what it feels like to be doing these things. Goal here and what's required for this is developing moments where we actually pause to do some reflection. And metacognition, I think a term that a lot of people are familiar with, it's just thinking about how we think. Metacognition, basically the equivalent of 15 IQ points, which, for somebody like me is a big difference. I kind of like the extra IQ points here. Just taking a moment to actually reflect on how I do learn and what I'm learning real time so I can incorporate it. My probably favorite application for this is in working with executives, kind of an audience I've disproportionately worked with over my career, because they have learned so much. And a lot of research supports that the development that they do, most of it actually happens on the job via experience. It turns out it's not working with me, right? I think it is. I always, this must be the most important thing of your day. From a learning perspective, it's not. About 70 to 80% happens on the job via experience. 10 to 20% occurs in things like workshops with Robleh, in LifeLabs. And another 10% just other experiences, watching people do things they've gone through in their lives. Now, it's also nice because most executives know that they've learned a lot, and they're pretty happy to share it because they'd like other people to know what they know. So I often will have conversations with them about what they've learned and how they've learned it, so we can get some additional buy-in for rolling that out across the organization, right? They know what they've learned, and they're confident that in the value of what they've learned. We want to create those experiences for other people. Now, in terms of creating time to actually pause and learn from this, that's kind of a critical step. We need this built into people's job descriptions. We need it built into their time allocations. And often you will see this at department levels where we're doing retrospectives, and that's great. I don't want to take anything away from doing retrospectives. Honestly, though, retrospectives is average. Taking a moment to reflect on what went well, what didn't go well. What great looks like is the proactive conversations in tandem with the retrospectives. And this has a big impact from an individual contributor perspective. If my manager at the end of a performance cycle or end of a project asks me what I learned, it honestly feels like they're checking a box. Right? If they have the conversation with me on the front end, hey, I'm excited about you working on this project because it's going to give you a chance to fill in the blank, develop your network, pick up this skill. It sets you up well for the next role that you're looking forward to. Now, all of a sudden, the perception is my manager is deeply invested in my personal growth and development, which we do know is related to engagement. And so we do want to be asking these questions, right? Well, what can we do differently next time, retrospectively? We also want to make sure we're having those learning plan conversations, even just simple conversations about why we've selected people to work on things. Now, I'm going to share an example from my advisor in graduate school. And this is a guy who literally wrote the book on leadership. He's written several books on leadership. And he was invited to speak at a keynote conference. And he said yes. And then a couple months before the conference, he told them, actually, I'm not going to do it unless all of the leaders that are attending also invite their mentees. So it's effectively double the budget for the keynote or for the conference. And they said yes. And so then he's going to do a panel conversation on mentorship with one of his mentees. And about 30 minutes before they were supposed to go on stage and give the presentation or the panel conversation, she pulls him aside and says, I'm not sure I can do this today. I said, okay, well, we got 30 minutes. Help me understand. I've seen you do this before. I'm sure you'll be fine. And well, it's not that. It's not that I'm nervous. It's just that I don't look at you as a mentor. And again, the guy who's written the book on leadership 30 minutes before he's doing a presentation on mentorship, she doesn't see him as a mentor. So, well, help me understand why. What's going on? She said, well, everything that we do, it's in service of you, what you're trying to accomplish. It's not for me. Now, what's being missed here in this is the reason he invited her to be on the panel is to grow her network and introduce her to people that are going to hire her later in her career. But because he didn't have that initial proactive conversation saying that, it comes across as, well, no, this is for you. Right? You're the keynote. I'm just here supporting you. And so I try to put some pressure on these proactive conversations and how critical they really are for active learning and development. Those are the three major conversations that I wanted to set out here and some tools that support it. You know what I'm going to do again is pause and give you an opportunity to think about tips that you've picked up in creating space for learning in your orgs, but also any questions that are on your mind. And it might be nice to phrase it in terms of what's a 10% improvement you can make to your systems. And if you made that 10% improvement, what types of issues do you think you might run into? Or pushback do you think you might get? Not enough time to do this, I think, is the number one pushback for everything. I as an external person, I sometimes get away with being just kind of like jerks to people. Maybe not as nice, say things more bluntly than I probably should. What I usually tell people is they don't have time to do things badly. Right? If we do development the wrong way, it takes a lot of time. Most of what we're talking about here today can be done with existing systems, right? People probably already have one-on-ones. They could probably dedicate 10 minutes of their one-on-ones to development. Right? And I think from an individual user perspective, that's the most important argument. I think from an executive position, it's a different argument, but it's making the same point. it's too important not to do this. In a rapidly changing environment, one of the biggest competitive edges you have is that you can outlearn the competition. And that puts some pressure on us, I think, in L&D, but it's also the truth. Right? If targets are changing, our employees want different things, our customers want different things, how quickly can we learn what they're looking for and how quickly can we adjust is really what it comes down to. All right, we've got another question here. Back to manufacturing. Time is something we are told the operators don't have. Yeah, surprise, surprise. How do people get around this when they are on a 24/7 operating and 12-hour shift? I'll open up the floor here for folks if you have tips. We have worked with folks on operating floors and manufacturing floors, so for sure we've seen it done. But it usually does require hitting the pause button. And, so it puts some pressure on this if it's not already built into the function of the role. I've seen this done in taking a day to do this. I've seen it done in taking a few hours, a quarter to do this. But again, there is a cost for the lack of development. And often what you can tie this is to retention levels. Right? We know it's an important factor for retention. People feel that they're learning and growing in their roles. Plenty of data out there to support it. A quick Google search will give you at least 5 different references for that. So it's expensive not to do this. And put it in context, this even happened internally at LifeLabs, giving you a peek behind the circus tent of what happens here. Years ago, we decided that Fridays were only going to be internal days. We don't do any client-facing work on Fridays. And as the company grew, this put a lot of pressure on the executive team, saying, this is a very expensive day. Right, we're not bringing in any revenue, 4 days out of the month, and I had to, maybe I am a little too blunt, but I said if we don't do this, it's going to be the most expensive day we don't have. Right? It's the only day that the team comes together, builds relationships, and learns from each other, and exchanges information about clients. Like, this will be a very expensive day if you decide to change it. Right? And actually, I never heard anything about it after that. That conversation.
And just to kind of jump in and add to that, I think often, I think there's studies year on year that find time is the most quoted reason for people not engaging with L&D. But often when you dig deeper into the data, you find people haven't got time to learn for the sake of learning. No one does, right? Like Robleh said, you're moving so fast, the markets are changing, targets are changing. So learning for the sake of learning isn't an option anymore. However, learning that I know I can apply back to the challenges I'm facing on a day-to-day basis, if I know it's going to move the needle for my individual performance as well as the collective performance, and I get that context of how it's going to be applied, it no longer feels like I'm doing it for the sake of doing it. I'm not doing it because the business said I had to do it at an arbitrary time. I'm doing it because I have a problem that by solving that problem, I know it's going to help me progress forward. And therefore I'm making time for it because I can see the difference it's going to make for me. And I think the example you gave there is a great one. The business recognizes allocating that time was having a great impact on the business, and therefore you're not going to get rid of that day that's allocated for it. And often, I think that's the disconnect, is when there's an L&D curriculum and program which is out of touch with what people actually need right now.
So I'm going to break cover and be the person that speaks, like, without using chat. Okay? Just because I'm sick, so I just thought it'd be easier for me to speak. So I agree with you wholeheartedly on that. I think some of the challenges, like particularly, and I know it's not particularly to our business, but is when you are in that growth phase as a company, and therefore it becomes very, very kind of task orientated. So I like the idea of the learning plan where you have that committed statement of how this is going to benefit the team and the business. Because then if you've had that conversation, then there's almost like a need for you, or a driver for you to do it, right? As opposed to, I'm just going to learn for the sake of learning because I want to develop something. And I think one of the challenges we face is because the management are, just as busy, although I do sometimes come back with remarks of, are you really busy or is it just noise? But is that a manager can undo all of that. So as much as we'll put something in place and try and get the buy-in and etc., but it can easily be undone by the manager by saying, oh, well, I quickly need you to do this or whatever else. And it kind of needs to be, it's a little bit of a tug of war, right, between the person in the team and their manager. I want the people, the learners, to feel empowered to say no and to stick to that and to really get that bit of learning done, because the results are going to be much stronger and much more beneficial. But that takes time. Like I wish there was a magic pill and it would just happen. But it's a constant kind of like balancing act between the manager versus the individual, if you like.
Yeah, a couple thoughts on that, Penny. One is whenever we start working with organizations, we actually target working with managers first, primarily for that reason, right? Once they've seen the value in taking the time to do it, it becomes much easier for them to support this across their teams. Similarly, when you're thinking about development goals for folks on their teams or them taking time to do stuff, I still want to start with the managers identifying the need. Yep. For the development. So at least high leverage development, if you think of a Venn diagram, there's kind of team needs and organizational needs, right? The team is going to grow. They're probably not performing at their peak yet. So what are kind of knowledge and skill gaps there? And then there's the individual learner has their own set of needs and growth areas of interest. And we're looking for the overlap, right? That shared variance where, the team needs this and the individual's interested in it. Let's get them some development in those areas. That makes the case, I think, a lot easier for kind of quote unquote making time for what's necessary to be done. And again, coming back to that 80% of development happens on the job. We can't pretend like people aren't learning all the time already anyway, right? All we're doing is creating a few moments here to really maximize the value on the learning that's already happening. Yeah, nice point, Michelle. I'm going to start saying that. Michelle in chat saying, I'd argue if the manager doesn't have time, they need to learn how to manage their time to amplify others. Well said. Well said. All right, open up the floor here. Again, other thoughts, questions, or comments on creating that learning culture inside of an org?
I have a quick question. Thank you so much for everything. I do want to ask quickly, how is it possible to kind of change that mindset that growth or learning is not only, vertically up the hierarchy and not about promotions, and how that they can also, learn different skills or improve their skills?
Yeah. Thanks for the question. And again, we're going to open up the floor. If anyone else has tips or advice on this, please, type it into chat. My perspective on it, again, I try to change the vocabulary that people use around this. Now, often, and this is this is my advisor in graduate school. Apparently this guy had a big impact on me. So he said, when I was maybe my second year in graduate school, he said, the worst thing you can do when you're looking for a job is tell people the job title that you're looking for. And I was like, well, that's all I've ever done. Like, what should I do instead? And he said, what you want to do is tell people the experiences that you're looking to have next. And this is that shift that you're talking about, that mindset shift. It's not about the next title or job you want. It's about the experience that you want. And there's a lot of self-serving value in this. It's also some benefit to the org. But for the individual, if I'm focused on the experience I want, I might be able to get that now. Right? I might be able to get that much faster than waiting around for a job title to become available. So we can get you down that track quicker. And also with the title, from a manager's perspective, that doesn't give them much to work with. And this is why it's kind of bad for the individual. If it's a title, it's a scarce resource that may or may not become available. I'm going to have to try to pitch this maybe to somebody. And there's a lot of variables outside of our control. With the experience, we can work on crafting it pretty quick. And I know exactly what you're looking for. People say they want a title. In reality, what they want is higher status, or they want a new experience, or they want growing responsibility, or they want a bigger paycheck, right? We don't know. A title is a placeholder for what they actually want. So the experience forces it out of them. It makes it a lot easier. Anyone else have tips here?
And just to just to kind of add to what you just said there, Robleh, I think it's quite a risky territory to tie learning and development to career progression, because often it opens up the risk of, say, I've been doing a bunch of learning, thinking this is the thing I need to do to get my next promotion, but then I don't get my next promotion. And in the moment that happens, the feedback loop essentially tells me, well, actually, what's the point of learning then? Because I'm no longer getting my career progression. And that's a huge risk. And so the expectation isn't learning equates to career progression. It's learning should translate into performance improvement, which then contributes to your career progression. And there's that step in between, which is critical. And so that association isn't made, because often we've seen it in organizations where, racking up your CPD points and certificates that you hang on your wall. And, it's there because I just want to shout to say, look at all this development I've done, therefore I deserve a promotion. And I think that's a risky situation to end up in. We've got about 10 odd minutes left in the session. Any kind of questions on any of the topics covered by Robleh so far?
I think everyone's
feel
going
free
to sleep
to
well
come on.
tonight.
Okay. Yeah. Right. If not, I've maybe we've got no questions from Michelle. Thank you very much. But the session was awesome. Thank you, Robleh, Nelson, Kim. We learned a lot personally. Thank you very much for coming. There are a few things, just a kind of summary. I'm going to try to give you some diamond feedback, Robleh. I thought that was super clear, relatable, and actionable knowledge. I think there's a lot we can take away and kind of put into practice. And I really love just kind of a summary of what we've covered, but the idea of engagement being critical to drive that discretionary effort. And I really like the kind of development plans being specific. And there's a few tips from the community around making it visible. I really like that. We're kind of learning from other people's learning development plans. I think is a great thought. And kind of focusing on those quick wins, or as Robleh said, the kind of Kaizen, the kind of improvement in a minute, I thought was a great actionable way of moving forward. And obviously the feedback, I'm definitely taking that, the kind of heart straight off. And it's a great way, like it was mentioned in the comments, a way of categorizing that feedback. And the learning extraction, I put my hands up. I've never really thought about it in a way of flagging or highlighting the learning opportunities before you actually do the work. I think I've heard often around the kind of retrospective and review of kind of reflecting back and picking out the learning moments, but doing it looking forward, I thought is really, really, and there's obviously so much more there. And it's probably going to take a few more listens and watches, which is great because the show is going to be available on YouTube, and you can also listen back to it on your favorite podcast apps. And before we close off, just again, a quick shout out and a thank you to Robleh for joining us today. So thank you very much, Robleh, for such a great session. And if you like what you see, there's more such sessions that you can get from LifeLabs. And like I said, we've worked with them, and they've also worked with many, many fast-growing companies. The next show, we're here again in 2 weeks' time on the 27th of actually, the next one is on the 27th of May. Look out for the email in your inbox. It's with Anouk Agasol from Unleashed, the CEO and founder. So it will be a great show then. And look out for the recording coming your way in email. Thank you once again for joining the show. Look forward to seeing you at the next one.
Hey, thanks, Nelson. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Godspeed.